Hello, my friends. I'm Don Chapman, host of Origins, which is the program you're watching right now. I have with me today Dr. Brad Harrop. Dr. Harrop has a degree from the University of Tennessee School of Medicine, and he's here today, and we're going to talk about the most basic of the whole argument about Origins, creation versus evolution. Now, Brad, it's so good to have you today.
Good to be here, Don.
But you have those framed as if creation and evolution are irreconcilable theories, but I meet Christians all the time who tell me they believe in both. Can you believe in both?
Unfortunately, there are a lot of Christians who would compromise and are trying to take what the world is saying as far as billions or millions of years and marry it with the Bible. But I think the Bible's very specific in that God did it precisely in 6 24-hour days. And there's not enough time. If you look at the genealogies, if you look at Bible history, there's not enough time to squeeze evolutionary time into it.
Plus, would you agree that evolution has become a kind of anti-God theory?
Definitely.
It's not just a scientific theory, but it's become a forum for people who don't want us to think there's a God out there.
At the root of it, everybody needs to understand the evolutionary theory is teaching that we all descended from a common ancestor that itself basically came from a non-living rock. There's not a whole lot of God in that picture.
No, there isn't. And there's a hostility towards God in a lot of it, isn't there?
Very much so. Very much so.
Well, let's talk about Origins, which is the name of our show, the very nexus of our beginning. What are the two paradigms we have to look at here?
Well, Charles Smith, atheist, he uttered the phrase at one point, "In the beginning was matter, which begat the amoeba, which begat the worm, which begat the fish, which begat the amphibian, which begat the reptile, which begat the lower mammal, which begat the lemur, which begat the monkey, which begat man, who he says imagined God." This, according to Charles Smith, is the genealogy of man.
He's not trying to be funny here. He honestly believes that God is something that man has dreamed up as a superstition because we couldn't handle reality.
That's precisely correct.
All right.
And if we compare that with the first two verses of the Bible, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Definitely a difference in those two beginning statements. One, you're saying, hey, man imagined God. The other is putting God in the driver's seat and saying he did it all.
And so we have two separate worldviews forming here.
Very much.
All right.
The problem is today, when our young people, when they run off to school, they're being taught only one theory for origins, and they're being taught as a fact.
Yeah, look at that with us.
Stephen Jay Gould, commenting on evolution, made the comment, he said, "Evolution is as well documented as any phenomenon in science, as strongly as the Earth's revolution around the sun, rather than vice versa." He said, "In this sense, we can call evolution a fact."
Bear with me a moment, but could Stephen Jay Gould really believe that?
He is trying to compare the theory of evolution with a known fact as far as we know the planets circle the sun.
Right.
And he's basically trying to say, hey, if you don't believe this, you don't believe this other truth that we know about.
You have a PhD in a scientific field. You haven't come to your beliefs out of ignorance. You've come to them out of studying fact.
Examining the evidence.
So why do we have these kind of statements?
I think a lot of it has to do with just intellectual peer pressure.
Okay.
You know, there's W.W. Howe said evolution is a fact just like digestion. 20 years earlier, in an article in Newsweek, Stephen Jay Gould said evolution is a fact just like apples falling out of trees. Jay Savage said no serious biologist today doubts the fact of evolution. The fact of evolution is amply clear. We don't need a listing of evidences to demonstrate the fact of evolution any more than we need to demonstrate the existence of mountain ranges. You know, Richard Dawkins, he sums it up. He says, it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that.
Usually when you reduce yourself to name calling, it's because you don't have enough facts to talk about. In other words, if I had clear evidence to present to you, I wouldn't have to demean you. I could have dialogue with you.
Right.
And so when I hear facts like that, it makes me more suspicious of evolution than it does creation.
The funny side is, you know, these men have had themselves put in print.
Right.
And yet, then some of their own evolutionary colleagues have come behind and said, for instance, nuclear physicist Theodore Thomisian, listen to what he says. Scientists who go about teaching that evolution is a fact of life are great con men, and the story they are telling may be the greatest hoax ever. In explaining evolution, we do not have one iota of fact. It's a tangled mishmash of guessing games and figure juggling.
Now, this is not a creationist saying this. This is a fellow evolutionist saying this. But he's saying you guys are acting as hucksters or con men,
right,
not as scientists when you're making those kind of statements.
That's right. Paul Davies and Adams Phillips, they give this little analogy. I like this analogy. They say some scientists say just throw energy at it and it'll happen spontaneously. That's a little bit like saying put a stick of dynamite under a pile of bricks and bang, you've got a house. Of course, you won't have a house, you'll just have a mess. Paul Davies went on to say there's powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. If we just defined what is evolution, what is creation, George A. Kirkut, he defined evolution when he said, on the other hand, there's a theory that all living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic or non-living form. This theory can be called the general theory of evolution.
Now, you're going to go up to the board and talk to us, and while you're walking, I'm going to ask you, there's something he says there that jumps out at me that we need to talk about. This theory, this whole business that from non-living material, you can get living material.
Right.
How often have you seen that happen?
Well, we've been trying in the laboratory for decades, and not a single occasion have we ever been able to create living material from non-living material.
And that, I think, is your first assumption there, isn't it?
Very first assumption. If evolution is true, then the first assumption is that non-living things gave rise to living material. That is, spontaneous generation occurred.
We used to believe in spontaneous generation. For example, we used to think that flies just sprung out of manure piles.
Right, right.
And then as we got microscopes, we found out there were eggs in there.
That's right.
So the increase of science made less likely the possibility of spontaneous generation.
And yet, that's the first thing we have to buy into.
It's a must, isn't
if
it?
evolution is correct.
That's right.
The second one is that this spontaneous generation occurred only once.
Yeah.
You know, why isn't it happening today?
Right.
A 12-year-old child can look at the situation and say, okay, at some point in the past, non-life had to give rise to life. Why don't we see that happening today?
Incredible.
Third is that viruses, bacteria, plants, and animals are all interrelated. If evolution is correct, then we all came from a common ancestor. Think about it for just a moment.
Yeah.
I suspect most of the viewers have had colds or maybe the flu in the past, and yet our bodies recognize those as foreign, even though according to evolution, we're all interrelated. The fourth point, the fourth assumption is that protozoa gave rise to metazoa. That is, organisms without a nucleus eventually decided they wanted to grow a nucleus and become more complex. And again, as you're looking at this list, we don't have scientific proof for any of them. Number 5, the fifth assumption is that various invertebrates, that is, animals without a backbone, they're all interrelated. And then number 6, those animals without a backbone, for whatever reason, decided, hey, we need to grow a backbone. And so they gave rise to the vertebrates. And then finally, seventh assumption is that all the vertebrates, fish, gave rise to amphibians. Amphibians gave rise to reptiles. Reptiles gave rise to birds and mammals. That's where we are with the evolutionary theory. If we were to look at the other side of the equation, what about creation? What about the creation model? According to the theory of creation, or as it may be more properly called the creation model, the universe is not self-contained. Everything in the universe, and in fact the universe itself, came into being through the design, purpose, and deliberate acts of a supernatural creator. There are your two arguments. You've got one that says, hey, everything self-contained, it just sprang into existence. One was not.
One said that God made it.
That's right.
Yeah.
If we look at the scientific evidence for how life got here, there is a scientific law known as the law of biogenesis, and unfortunately, this particular scientific law is kind of being eradicated from many of the textbooks. Doesn't make it any less scientific, but this law leans heavily in favor of the creation model. George Wald, Nobel laureate of Harvard, said, most modern biologists, having reviewed with satisfaction the downfall of the spontaneous generation hypothesis, yet unwilling to accept the alternative belief in special creation, are left with nothing. He said, I think a scientist has no choice but to approach the origin of life through a hypothesis of spontaneous generation.
So even if all of the facts, everything I learn as a scientist teaches me this can't happen,
Right.
I still have to believe it happened.
We know spontaneous generation doesn't occur, but he says you're only left with one choice. We don't like that choice.
We're not going there.
So what we're going to do is we're going to believe something we know to be wrong.
Incredible.
If we look at Francis Crick, one of the gentlemen who is given credit for creating the molecular structure for DNA, he said, an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going.
I think when God spoke and said, let there be life, that it was a miracle.
That's
yes.
right, that's right. Sir Fred Hoyle, who was knighted for his scientific achievements, a man who, in fact, anybody who was studying physics back in the 60s, 70s, you studied some of his physics theories. He said the likelihood of spontaneous formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 noughts or zeros after it. It is big enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There was no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor any other, and if the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence.
To which I say amen.
All of the evidence continues to point towards the creation model. He gave another example. I love this example. He said, imagine 10 to the 50th blind persons, each with a scrambled Rubik's Cube. Now, you remember many years ago there was a Rubik's Cube little puzzle.
I had one.
He said, imagine 10 to the 50th blind people and try to conceive of the chance of them all simultaneously arriving at the solved form. He said, you then have the chance of arriving by random shuffling at just one of the many biopolymers on which life begins. You know, let's negate the fact that there's not that many blind people in the world today, 10 to the 50th power, but imagine all of them coming to that solved form at exactly the same time. He's saying, folks, that's what it would take to get the proteins together for just one biopolymer. That's the theory that's being taught today. Martin A. Moe, an evolutionist, he said, a century of sensational discoveries in the biological sciences has taught us life arises only from life. Now, simply put, that very statement violates the evolutionary theory completely. Because in order for evolution to be correct, we had to at one point get life from non-life.
That's right.
And yet they admit we can't make that jump. And yet we look at what's coming into our home, we look at what our children are learning, and time again, rather than it being a situation where we're actually evaluating the evidence, it's just a perpetuation of the evolutionary lies. For instance, most folks have probably heard of Neanderthal man. In fact, I would say most of our viewers are very familiar with him. What most folks don't know is that creature, they examined the original fossils. Here you see on the screen from Neander Valley. A fellow by the name of Dr. A.J. Cave examined them in 1958, and he proved that it was nothing more than a man who had suffered from arthritis. Yeah. We can talk about Rhodesian man, who was found in a zinc mine, 1921, displayed prominently there in the British Museum of Natural History. Now, you know, Don, think about how many young people walk through museums, they look at these things, and they think, hey, that's the answer. The only problem was Rhodesian man's pelvic bones had been crushed. They sent him to this museum. They let bird specialists set him upright in the exhibit, and they fashioned him stooping over. Looked basically kind of like a cave-like creature. And it was only later, after true anatomists had come along, they realized the mistake. They realized he wasn't a stooping man. He was a modern man, and even had tooth decay just like you and I. And yet how many thousands of young people walked by, looked at that display, and assumed this was a creature on its way to becoming human. Yeah. Or we could talk, for instance, about Orc man. Single piece of bone around the parieto-occipital region of the skull, right back here. From that one piece of bone, some overeager scientists decided they had another missing link. The only problem was that one piece of bone, later we discovered, belonged to a 6-month-old donkey. Last but not least, Don, we've got Flipper man. 1979, a collarbone was found. It's actually this middle bone you see here on the screen. They dated the plankton around it, said, oh, it's roughly 5 million years. I love how they just kind of come up with round numbers. marched it into a science conference and said, we've got one of the oldest upright walking bones of a humanoid fossil. Scientists there in the audience said, fellas, you got a little problem. That's not a collarbone, that's a rib bone. They did what most scientists would do. Oh, okay, well, then we got a 5 million-year-old rib bone here. He said, no, that's not the rib bone of a human. That's the rib bone of a dolphin.
Huh. Flipper man is just Flipper, no man.
I'm going to let Jeremy Rifkin tell you what the fossil record shows, because I think he summed it up extremely well, and it's what our kids are not seeing in their textbooks. He said what the record shows is nearly a century of fudging and finagling by scientists attempting to force various fossil morsels and fragments to conform with Darwin's notions, all to no avail. Today, the millions of fossils stand as very visible, ever-present reminders of the paltriness of the arguments and the overall shabbiness of the theory that marches under the banner of evolution.
Well said. Dr. Brad, we have to take a break. When we come back, though, I want to ask you, because you've talked about a young Earth, and certainly we've seen the fudging and the finagling of the evolutionists in their fossil records and so on, and we still have this huge leap of how you get from inanimate life to life. But it seems to me that if we're going to make things like coal that take millions and millions a year, then we have to have an old Earth. And so I need you to help me with that. So folks, don't you go away. We're going to talk about coal and about how old this Earth has to be in order to make coal. Is this a young Earth or an old Earth? We're going to have an answer for you when you come back, so don't go away.
Today's guest on Origins, Dr. Brad Harrop, is the co-founder of Focus Press Incorporated. He's also the co-editor of Think Magazine, where he's contributed many articles concerning the subject of creation. If you're searching for the truth and God's answers to life's questions, you'll want to subscribe to Think Magazine. Orders are being taken at 866-313-6474. For more information about Dr. Harrop, you can write to Focus Press Incorporated, 1600 Westgate Circle, Suite 125, Brentwood, Tennessee 37027. Or visit the website at www.focuspress.org.
We're back, and Dr. Brad Harrop is here with us, and we're just talking about the whole evolution versus creationist debate. And Dr. Harrop, as we look at the issue of coal, if the Earth isn't old, how can coal, it would take millions of years to make it, how can it be formed?
Well, you know, evolutionists maintain that coal was laid down during the Carboniferous period 250 million years ago. So on the screen, you know, we ask the question, what do you think of when you think of coal? Do we think of lots of vegetation? Well, we know you've got to have that. You got to have heat. You got to have pressure. But does it take millions of years? I would say absolutely not. In fact, I'm going to show you some evidence that that's incorrect. J.D. Saxby, in talking about making oil and coal and natural gas, he said, many geological situations, much longer time intervals are available. He's kind of guarding himself there, saying, you know, I still buy into the evolution. But notice what he goes on to say. But evidently, the molecular mechanism of decomposition is little changed by the additional time. Thus, within sedimentary basins, heating times of several years are sufficient for the generation of oil and gas from suitable precursors.
So that means that the existence of coal doesn't necessarily mean old Earth.
That's right. In fact, in a laboratory setting, we can make some of these products for you within weeks to months. Now, don't expect us to heat your home with it yet, because it's expensive to do that in a lab, but we can do it. You know, when we think about coal, a lot of times we think, okay, millions of years, we're thinking it had to be laid down long before humans ever existed, and yet we have a lot of physical evidence that disproves that. For instance, Ivan Sanderson, he was talking about one of the discoveries that were found in coal many, many years ago. He said, for instance, it's been reported 1891, Miss Culp of Morrisonville, Illinois, dropped a shovel full of coal, transferring it to her cooking range. A large lump broke in two, disclosing a lovely little gold chain of intricate workmanship, neatly coiled and embedded.
And that's not an isolated story, is it?
That is far from being an isolated.
There are many instances like that.
And it's not just gold chains or iron pots. We've also discovered human footprints in coal. Now, if you think with me for just a moment, according to evolutionists, humans have only been around the last 3 to 5 million years. They say coal was laid down 250 million. How do you get a human footprint in coal? Albert Ingalls said, on sites reaching from Virginia, Pennsylvania, through Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, westward toward the Rocky Mountains, prints have from time to time been found on the surface of exposed rock. More and more keep turning up as the years go by. What made these prints? As yet, the answer is unknown to science. They look like human footprints. And it's often been said, though not by scientists, that they really are human footprints made in the soft mud before it became rock. He went on to say, if man made these prints in this matter, then man's antiquity is no matter of a mere million years or so, as scientists think, but 250 million years, for they're found in the rocks of the Carboniferous period, and those rocks were laid down 250 million years ago.
So old Albert, instead of assuming that coal is young, assumed that man's been around for 250 million years.
That's right. And there's some pictures there on the screen of exactly what they found. And you know, the viewers probably are going to be immediately thinking, wait a second, my toes aren't splayed out like that. And that's true, because today our feet are housed in shoes, and that kind of confines them. But the two pictures at the bottom show Aborigines who habitually go unshod. That is, they don't wear shoes, and you'll notice their toes are spreading out. And Don, so many of these footprints were showing up that they asked Albert Ingalls to provide an explanation. And before that happened, they wanted to know, are we really talking about human footprints? So a fellow by the name of A.E. Wildersmith, he examined them. Here's what he said. The tracks are in the formations considered to be the Upper Carboniferous, 250 million years old. They show 5 toes, an arch which is unquestionably human. The tracks are 9.5 inches long, 4.1 inches broad at the heel. The width at the forward end of the track by the toes was 6 inches. The being that left the tracks was a biped that walked uprightly like a human.
Like a human.
I want to share with you how Albert Ingalls explained away these footprints. Here's his explanation. He said, if man, or even his ape ancestor, or even the ape ancestor's early mammal ancestor existed as far back as the Carboniferous period in any shape, then the whole science of geology is so completely wrong that all geologists will resign their jobs and take up truck driving. Hence, for the present at least, science rejects the attractive explanation that man made these mysterious prints in the mud of the Carboniferous period with his feet.
So after Albert's done talking, the footprints aren't there.
That is his explanation. You know, I spent 23 years of my life in school, and never did I ever hear somebody say that science rejects an attractive explanation.
It's just incredible to me. You have one more quote there that I think explains all of this.
Richard Lewontin, in describing the current attitude in academia and science, he said, we're forced to our adherence to materialism. No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated, moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
I thought we were arguing with honest people who were truly seeking truth and had just come to a different conclusion. But over and over again, we see deception and fraud and deliberately misleading people. And I would just say to all of our folks, don't be naive. And I would say especially to the parents, don't let your children just swallow evolution whole without having to think and think about the consequences and really looking at the evidence. The evidence for God as our Creator is overwhelming. The basic questions about where did the world come from? How did life come from non-life? How do simple creatures become more complex creatures? All of those things are things that evolutionists just skirt around and never answer. We always come back to the same old truth. You know, you can have 1,000 lies, but only one truth. And the truth is always going to be the same, that it's God's view that He created you. And that should be your worldview too. Thanks for hearing us. I hope you'll think long and hard about the things that Dr. Harab says today. And I hope you'll join us again next time. Until then, God bless you.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. To get a copy of the information presented today, you can download a PDF file of program number 1102 from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for a DVD of this series, send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins, program number 1102, Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and the financial support of you, our Cornerstone Television family.